Hello everyone, and welcome to the session on strengthening data journalism. I'm Jessica Abrahams. I'm Deputy Editor of DevEx, the media platform for the global development community, and I'll be guiding you through today's session. Hopefully you can all hear me okay, but do send us a message if you can't. I'm joined today by a brilliant panel of speakers who I'll introduce you to in just a minute. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about this session. It's the 18th in a series hosted by the UN Statistics Division as part of the run-up to the UN World Data Forum. The forum aims to foster cooperation and open dialogue among government, researchers, the private sector, civil society, and more around how data can be used to accelerate progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Our topic for today is strengthening the use of data in journalism, and we'd love to know who's joining us for the conversation today. So to kick off, I'd love to invite you to find the chat function, which is the icon that looks like a speak bubble, a chat bubble in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, I believe. So find that and just type in 2 words, the country you're joining us from and the sector you represent, whether you work for an international organisation or an NGO or a private company perhaps. It would be great to get a sense of who's joining the conversation today. We do ask you to remain on mute during this session unless you're a designated speaker, but you can use the chat function to communicate with us and with other participants. If you want to have a discussion, if there are things that spark your interest, please feel free to do that. Here's how the session's going to run. Each of the speakers is going to give us a presentation, and we'll have time for questions after that. So please do send questions via that chat function throughout the session. If you hear things that pique your interest, if you want more insight or more explanation on something, the more the merrier. So please do send your questions and our moderators will pick them up. We've also received a lot of really interesting questions ahead of today's session that have helped to shape the conversation we're about to have, and we've picked out a few that the panelists will address later as well. So we'll have 4 presentations from the panelists and then time for the Q&A at the end, so please do stick around for that. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm obviously a journalist, and I was really pleased actually when I was asked to moderate this session, because I think it's such an important topic. As journalists, we use data in our work in a wide variety of ways. Sometimes it can form the core of a story. If, for example, you spot a trend in a data set that tells you something surprising or interesting, and tells the reader something that we didn't know before. Sometimes it can form the basis of graphics that help us communicate stories to a reader. And sometimes it just helps us to fact check or to substantiate a story. But those data skills are really core to the work that we do. And this year has only proved how important data is to journalism. At a time of global crisis, data has been absolutely central to keeping the public well informed and holding institutions to account on everything from infection rates to fatality rates and the availability of hospital beds. So many of the news stories that we've all been reading over this past year to keep ourselves informed have been data stories. And we've seen some great examples of that. We've also seen some great examples of data visualization coming out of newsrooms as well, helping readers to make sense of this big, massive data that's been pouring out from institutions of various kinds. But at the same time, we all know that trust in the media is already very low. And it's so important that we use the right data in the right ways, because the consequences of getting it wrong can be really serious. So as an example that came up last year, what does the fatality rate mean, for example? How are we measuring that? How do we explain to our readers what that means? Sometimes as journalists, we don't pick the right data to use, or we don't use it in the right way, or we simply don't have access to the sources of data that we'd ideally want to use. So this is the challenge that we're going to be talking about today. To promote the use of data in journalism, journalists need reliable, trusted data that is easy to access and easy to understand and use. And that means that the people and organisations producing data need to provide timely, relevant and quality data in ways that are user-friendly. But on the flip side of that, journalists require the skill set for understanding and analysing and visualising and communicating that data to our readers. So to help us discuss some of those issues, we're going to hear from a brilliant panel of speakers. And first up, I'd like to introduce Sarah Cohen, who's a data journalist, author, and the Knight Chair at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University. She's worked as a reporter and editor for the New York Times and the Washington Post, where her work was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in investigative reporting. So Sarah, thanks so much for joining us. You obviously have a lot of expertise to share with us on this topic, so it seems like your presentation would be a great place to begin.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to thank the World Forum for this. That this is such an important issue, and it's so important for us as journalists to be able to talk with the people who are producing data. So I really appreciate the time that you've given us. I'm going to expand a little bit on what Jessica was talking about, because sometimes when people think of data journalism, they kind of think of numbers and stories. And what I want to kind of think about is to put the way that journalists use data into kind of three buckets. And the first one is something where a story is what I call about the data. And it's the background statistics, and it's all of the background information you need to produce a story. And I think that's what a lot of people think of when they think of data journalism. In the US, Vox.com, 538, the New York Times' Upshot are among the most prominent of these kinds of stories. But so is the Guardian's data journalism blog and elsewhere. Another huge use of data, as Jessica suggested, is in the use of in creating visualizations that help guide readers and viewers through a complicated topic. It's something that we often talk about as explanatory visualization, in which you're trying to use data to help explain a trend or explain something that's going on. And then I would put accountability reporting, which is a very US centric term, I think, in the last bucket, which is the one that I'm most familiar with in investigative journalism. And where journalists are holding powerful institutions accountable for their actions. And using data sets more than what most people think of as data is really crucial to that. I just finished judging one contest on data journalism in the US. I'm about to start judging an international one. And the entries span all three of those kinds of stories. So we often kind of mush them together, and it's worth thinking about who your audience is for the different sets of stories, because it really has a lot to do with what they need. We can go to the next slide. The kinds of data that's required for each of these kinds of stories is very different. And I'm going to work from right to left, because even though the data is produced left to right. So I think a lot of agencies are very engaged in the idea of trying to provide dashboard data for consumers so that they do the explanation of the data, and it is presented in a very specific way so that it can't be misunderstood. And I get the idea of that it's in a simple way of understanding it. This is something that when a journalist calls and says, I just need a number for my story, basically, this is the kind of place that they're going to go for that. And or I want to look at a trend, and that way they can look to see what trends a data provider thinks are important to look at. You really don't run much risk with these kind of compilations or dashboards that somebody's going to completely misunderstand what you're doing. It requires a little bit less knowledge about the data from the journalist, but it does limit what they can do. And the reason is obviously they have to rely on exactly what the message that the data provider wanted to provide. In the middle is what a lot of the data visualizations rely on, which is a little bit more granular information that they can mix and match in different ways. And for them, one of the most important things that they need is something that's in a standard open data format, CSVs or something like it, something that's well defined, and something that is consistent over time, and is complete. One of the things you can't kind of brush over in a visualization is missing data. And so it really hurts those kinds of analyses if you can't get something that's complete over time. But they rarely need personally identifiable information. And you can see it in the COVID data visualizations that you see, so that these are kind of analysis-friendly statistical compilations and things that have common definitions across data sets. And the last one is what I would call the administrative records that we use in investigative reporting. A really good example of this was in the New York Times a few months ago, when the reporters there got the individual death certificate information from one state in the US, and the results that they came up with were very different than what you would have gotten from the compiled data in terms of excess deaths from COVID. And this kind of information often does require personally identifiable information, or it might require something that is really geographically precise in order for it to be of use. They're also looking a lot at the microdata of surveys that are made available with agreements from the agencies. And believe it or not, reporters are very good at following those agreements. I know a lot of agencies don't really trust us for that. If you want to go to the next one. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the implications for this for agencies and for data providers, as well as for journalists who are trying to think about how they want to use data. One implication is that it really makes a big difference to release as much detail as possible in different forms. That different types of data journalism require different forms and different amounts of information. The second thing is to not assume that you know why a journalist is looking at the data. I hate to say it, but they rarely are going to tell the story you want them to tell. That they are looking at it as background to other stories. They're looking to tell a different story than the one that is widely told by other people. So I think one frustration among some data providers is that we don't tell the story that you want us to tell, and instead what happens is then you're frustrated because you've put all this work into these presentations and they're not being used by journalists. Our problem is that we get to only tell the same story once, and so or once every 6 months or once a year, so it's not going to be kind of an ongoing thing. Another implication is to help reporters and help the public understand the background behind the records. Where do they come from? Where are things that we should be careful about? Having a back and forth dialogue about the quality of the data, the consistency of the data, and warnings about the data is very useful, and getting that dialogue going is incredibly important. And that involves training sometimes journalists on the qualities of the data. Here in the US, we often have webinars with our Census Bureau that help us understand kind of the details behind some of it. And, only half a dozen or a dozen people will show up for those training programs, but those people will then be distributing the information that they get to other reporters. So they will be helping other reporters use the data. So the impact of that training is much higher than it seems. And obviously we have an issue with numeracy among journalists, and that's our problem, that we have to do a better job of getting reporters to pay attention to data and to stop thinking, I just want a number for my story, and to start having them put a little bit, as much effort into the data that's in their stories as they put into the quotes and into the anecdotes in their stories. So that's our problem, and we keep trying to move forward on that. I know we wanted to keep this short, so I'm going to stop here, but I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the other presentations are. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was a really brilliant introduction to the topic and to some of the issues, and to how you use data in your work as a journalist as well. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about that. To follow up and to kind of expand on that perspective from the media side, we're also joined by Catherine Gacheru, who is a Knight Fellow with the International Centre for Journalists and is currently spearheading the Africa Women Journalism Project to help drive the coverage of underreported gender, health and development issues and strengthen the voices of women journalists by helping them to innovate in their newsrooms. So thank you so much for joining us, Catherine. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what insights you have to share from that experience as well.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I'm so glad to be here. I am very happy that Sarah has kind of laid out the situation for journalists when it comes to accessing data and what data is there. But I just wanted to bring from where we're coming from, and especially in situations where data is not very easily accessible. What can journalists do? They want to use data for their storytelling. What are those challenges? So I will kind of talk about the experiences we've been going through, or I have been going through with the AWJP and the fellows, the women journalists we've been working with, as well as the newsrooms. So, like she said, journalists need to kind of acquire new skills. But before that, we really need to be able to access data. And the situation in most of our countries is that data might be there, but it is very old or it's very dated. So sometimes you're looking, even example, a good example is just trying to figure out, wanting to compare finding out how many people died same time last year, same time this year, same period. Getting access to the death registry, for example, is totally impossible in most of our countries. So journalists need to be innovative in how they access data, because the statistics office most likely are not willing to share the data with you. And even if they may want to share it with you, they don't have it, or they may not be collecting it. So some of the ways that we've found make sense is actually forging relationships with those who have access to some of this data, and where it does not exist, actually creating your own data sets. And that means a whole gamut of things which we won't go into right now. The other thing is obviously acquiring new skills. We know journalists need to go beyond just the words. They need to be able to understand the numbers. And some of the ways we've been doing this is actually training guys or training journalists on how to use spreadsheets, because it's not everybody who can do that. And that's just the beginning. But also, in our own experience, we've found that journalists working together can create, they need to be able to collaborate, because it's not a one-man show. Like maybe you want to do an expose, it's not really a one-man show all the time. And if we collaborate, then we're able to get more information. I have my sources, you have your sources. We can actually collaborate and figure out whether what we're getting is actually what should be, or what could be, or what is. So there are ways we need to be able to collaborate. And obviously, we've been doing a lot of training on this as AWJP, and there are quite a number of organizations that are doing that, including some of these schools of journalism. Next slide, please. As far as engaging with, one of the things that we've also realized, and what we have been able to do, is actually encourage and train journalists on data literacy, because sometimes the data is provided by the National Statistics Office, and but being able to interpret what those numbers mean, but also being able to put together a coherent story that makes sense for your audiences, and that is speaking to the issues that your audience might be interested in, or the concerns that they may have, is a skill that needs to be brought up and encouraged. And the one thing we've been telling, and we believe and we know, is that we need to be as skeptical about the data that we're provided, sometimes by the NSOs and sometimes also by researchers. We need to be able to understand where it's coming from, who is doing it for, and all that. The same way you're skeptical about some source who is giving you information about something. So figuring out the biases or the variables and all the rest of it is really, really, really crucial. And also being able to contextualize that information or that data in the lives of your audiences. So, for example, we've been getting all these numbers about COVID-16 people today infected, whatever. What does that mean for your audience if all you're doing is just saying how many people are dying or have died or have become infected or have been tested? Being able to show whether we are actually, that's one of the stories we've been able to do, being able to show whether we've actually picked, or we're going through the second wave and when it could have started, in itself is, and then finding out at what point did the second wave start. Is it when we opened up and we started having political rallies, for example, in Kenya, where we had these huge meetings and people are not observing social distance and everything. So we are then able to contextualize and tell people, by the way, this started at this point and this is why it's happening and this is how it's been spreading. And then you are able to reinforce the messaging about wearing masks and all the rest of the preventive measures that we've been told that we need to take. At the same time, is also giving your audience information that they can use to make decisions, so that they don't feel woe and gloom and doom, we're all going to die. You need to leave them with some hope that they actually have within themselves, or you've given them information they can use to make decisions that will provide change or can change things, so that they don't feel helpless. And then the other thing is also understanding, how do you select, what data do you select, and how do you use it to tell a story? You need to be honest enough to admit that some of the data that you've been using may not be complete. And this is what we've been doing, especially our data around COVID or SGBV instances within marginalized communities, especially women in IDP camps and women and girls in IDP camps. We know that the data is not complete, and we actually make sure that we say that is what we've been able to get, and this is, we cannot give you a complete picture, but this is how the situation is like. And then the other thing is also being able to understand what visuals you can use to present this data, because we've had a situation where they're very beautiful visuals, but they really don't communicate. And thank God, because we've been able to kind of get a gist of what it is. Some of the stuff I've seen, especially, for example, in NYT or some of the newspapers or websites, are very, very complex. And understanding that most people are accessing their news on phone, you cannot do very heavy visuals, which will take forever to download, and the data is expensive. So you also need to be able to understand how and what actually do you want to communicate. So you strip it down to the bare minimum, so that at least people can be able to interact with that. I'll be able to talk about, in terms of the other thing, last and final thing, how do we as journalists then are able to make sure that we do not support or how do you call the word? What's the word? Encourage politicians, especially, or even corporates, to use the data that is available, they skew it in favor of their agenda or whatever. One of those things is obviously data literacy, and having a very healthy skepticism of whatever data that anybody is sharing with you, and trying to be able to find ways of getting that information corroborated through various different sources, not just one. So I'll end there and hope you guys can ask questions, or I can add more to that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. There were a lot of really interesting points there about the challenges of working with journalism, with data as a journalist, especially depending on what context you're working in or what countries you're working in. So we'll come back to some of those issues later. But hopefully we have a good sense now of the issues that are involved here when we're coming at it from the journalism side. But as we mentioned earlier, there are two sides to this equation. And I can see from the chat that a lot of you who are listening today work for data producing organisations, and perhaps you're wondering about how you can make that data useful for journalists. So to hear from the perspective of the data producers, I'd like to introduce Ashwell Jenica, who is Deputy Director General at Statistics South Africa, where he's worked for more than 2 decades. As part of his current role, he's responsible for all statistical operations, including coordination of household surveys and censuses, provincial operations, and data processing. So Ashwell, thank you for joining us, and we'd love to hear about some of these issues as you see it.
Thank you very much. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk about data stories. And the idea behind the data stories is to increase the relevance of our organization. I mean, we're a statistics organization in South Africa. And what we want to do is we want to reach audiences that we would not have reached previously. So in South Africa, we need to take into account that our mathematical and statistical literacy is on the lower end. So we need to do a little bit more as a stats agency to make sure that people understand data, to make sure that journalists understand data. And so we do have around about 4 training sessions a year for journalists to understand it. But let's talk more about data stories. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how do we determine what a data story is, or how do we determine what sort of a data story to do? So firstly, we look at some issues that's topical. For example, you've got things like International Cake Day. So when that happens, we look at the price of cake in the CPI and then see if we can do a story on that. Or we look at International Beer Day, and we do stories on that. Or when we release the births and the deaths, we might do a story on what's the most popular name in South Africa. We had an interesting data story a while ago about an 80-gram slab of chocolate. Now, most people love chocolate. So it turns out that there's differences in the price of chocolate depending on what region you stay in South Africa. So the Port Elizabeth, which is a major town in the Eastern Cape, chocolate was cheapest within Port Elizabeth. So we did a data story on that, and it then became very popular. Next slide. Okay, so how do we do a data story? It's almost a sort of a recipe that we follow. We make sure it's short because you want this to be shared on Facebook, Twitter, and what we find is that the mainstream media also loves that. They sort of pick up. So you've got a catchy heading. So for example, the chocolate story, you might find, where can you find the cheapest slab of chocolates in South Africa? And then you have an interesting first paragraph so that you can hook people. And then you need to have one or at least one graphic so that that links easily into the social media space. And then we'll have more information at the bottom so that you can give the more serious reader a look into what statistical release is. Okay, next slide. Okay, let's go through those. Next slide. Okay, so what we do is we try to develop infographics, and those then get shared on social media. And what we found is that the traditional media then also picks up those slides and those infographics and use it in their data stories. What we also find is that search engines also, we get quite high ranking from the data stories in search engines. So what you need to do is then the communications department will link up with the subject matter specialist and say, what interesting facts are there in the data that gets released? And we try to do a story around that. Okay, next slide. And what we find is that we've sort of started in 2017 around this, and we had about 8.5% of unique page views on our website, whereas now in the first quarter of 2020-2021, we had 195,000, more than 195,000 unique page views on our website just on the data stories, which is 13.3%. So what we can see over time, the idea of creating some visibility for data sets which might not otherwise be visible has come quite to the fore by creating data stories. And so we're encouraging subject matter specialists within the organization to actively look for these data stories so that we can produce quite a number of data stories as we go on from release to release. Okay, thank you very much. I think that's the end of my story.
Thank you, Ashwell. It's been great to hear a bit about the kind of stories that you guys are producing from the data you have and the work that you do with journalists, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that later. But to bring us on to our final presentation now, we've got another perspective from the producer's side. We're joined by Anders Pedersen, who is Resource Watch Director at the World Resources Institute. As a researcher with more than 15 years' experience, he uses emerging technologies and open data to shape evidence-based advocacy and policy priorities. And he's advised on the development of global data standards and serves on the program committee for the International Open Data Conference. So I think he's brilliantly placed to speak on this theme. Welcome, Anders, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, and really great to see so many people joining from all over the world, and fantastic to see so many different sectors represented. So just from the chat thread, I see several from statistical agencies, from the private sector, from nonprofits, from other government agencies, and bilateral donors. So it's great to have this amount of diversity in the panel, and I'd agree with all other speakers earlier to say that like this is a really critical component, and it's one that has maybe in the last 10 years of open data have been not always fully appreciated, sort of how important it is reaching journalists with open data and how important it is to build capacity around it. So I'm going to speak a little bit about what we do at Resource Watch and also provide some examples of how we have worked to do capacity development and training with journalists in order to drive impact with the data we produce. So a little bit about Resource Watch. We're hosted at World Resources Institute, which is a global think and do tank that work on environmental and pressing sustainability issues. We are 1,000 people around the world, and we work with we have country offices in places such as India, China, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Brazil, and Mexico. And what we really wanted to do with Resource Watch was at WRI, we had a number of experiences creating domain-specific data platforms for geospatial data. So some of you may know Global Forest Watch, which monitors deforestation, and some of you may also know Aqueduct, which monitors water stress and provides outputs on at very local level where you can see how water stress is projected both now and in the future. So Resource Watch is cross-cutting. So that means we host today more than 300 data sets. Here are more than 50 in near real time that are geospatial global data sets that cuts across everything from water to energy to climate, cities data. And we do so in a way where users can easily overlay and connect the dots between various issues. So we help users connect the dots between air quality and the coal-fired power plants, for example, that might that negatively affect air quality. Many open data portals out there provide the data. We go a step further and try to provide multiple layers, and I'll show one of those examples. So, but we realized as part of that process, we launched in 2018. We realized that it's really not enough to just provide the data, provide the powerful visualizations. We thought we also need to connect with users, and we need to find out how journalists can use our data. And so we organized a workshop and a story grant program with Internews and with our office in Indonesia to train 17 reporters in how to work with data broadly in their journalism, how to use Resource Watch as a source of data and as a visualization tool. And then we followed up with extensive mentoring an engagement where we helped guide how to process individual data sets, how to find additional data sets, that type of work. And so that ended up being a total of, oh, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. That ended up being, I think I still get feedback. That ended up comprising, we ended up completing a program of more than 10 months from the initial training to then the full sort of mentoring support, and then followed by finally a number of stories which got published. And one of them was an 8-part series on the connection between sea level rise and other environmental factors. And it really showed, to me, I think there's a couple of important lessons from this. We learned that taking the step for journalists, taking the step to really do in-depth data reporting takes time. It takes resources, and you really need often direct support. We also learned that some of this is not just easily scalable from global data platforms. Often local journalists will need local data to combine with the global data sources. So while you may have global sea level rise data, you may need local data on, for example, waste, on, for example, what type of physical infrastructure may be at risk. You maybe need a number of local data sets that needs to be combined with the global data sources. So we'd had some really important lessons, and we and maybe next slide, if possible. And these are some of the example stories we did. That came out from this. Anything from fires to coverage on palm oil plantations. We also had some interesting stories on plastic waste, where we really had to dive deep, find new data sets that could be used. So this is to me, this is an example of how data providers can really connect with journalists and can help stimulate ideas for data stories, but it also very much spoke to the scope of our challenge. And I think Sarah Cohn mentioned earlier that the Census Bureau is actually doing webinars in a similar way, and while they may not be frequently attended, they have huge impact because they have a cascading effect on the larger journalist community. And I think that's very much what we learned as well through this training. I think the remaining challenges we see, as I think are still there, in the sense that journalists do have limited time in their schedule. That's something we'll need to continue to think about. Online resources can do a lot, but individual mentoring is incredibly valuable. And so I think we still need to address and consider the challenge of how do we make sure that that journalists can get access not only to MOOCs, like massive online courses, but also to individual mentoring. I think those are some of the sort of institutional challenges that we'll continue to have to continue to deal with, but definitely some very important lessons. And next slide. And so this, with this, I wanted to share an example of how Resource Watch looks when you do one of these overlays. And this is an example of population density and projected sea level rise in the future. And so what you can see is that there will be that you can see the connection between that some of the really dense populated areas in the world, in this case in China, will have to deal with flooding in the increased flooding risk in the future. We have huge populations around the world who are who live in areas near the sea, near flooding near flood deltas, and those peoples will be exposed to sea level rise in the future. You can also see that in this case we have a time series slider also that allow you to look at the development from 1975 to up until 2015. So so this is an example of also, I think, how ResourceWatch sort of adds a feature to the other global data portals that are out there, in that it really provides the overlay function where you can do this type of analysis. I've previously mentioned that we have the same features for air quality and power generation, for example. We also have very good examples on how you can connect, for example, water security and conflict, and the list goes on. Resourcewatch.org is the URL. I'm really glad to answer any questions about our capacity development training in Indonesia or about the ResourceWatch platform. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anders. It was great to hear about some of those case studies that you've been working on and get some kind of concrete idea of how this can work. And thanks also to all of our speakers for those presentations. As promised, we do have time now for some questions. So I'm going to kick off with some questions that were sent in advance, but we will also move to some of the live questions that you guys have been sending in during the discussion. So please do keep them coming. But first off, I'm going to start with a question for the journalists, I think, about how you select the most compelling and telling data for a non-technical audience. Sarah, would you like to tackle that one maybe?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. The question is about how, as journalists, you select the most compelling and telling data to present to a non-technical audience.
I think a lot of times it really depends on what kind of story you're working on. Often what we do is we start with a question, and then we seek out the data that answers that question or addresses that question the most directly. One of the things that makes that a little bit difficult sometimes is that scientists in particular are doing a lot of work with what I would call inferential statistics or projections. And journalists tend to want to present the world as it is, not as it might be. So a lot of times we're kind of limited in terms of descriptive data as opposed to study data. So generally what we will do is start with a question and seek out the most directly addressable data that we can. And then the simplification process makes it a lot easier because we're trying to answer a fairly simple question. And so we're starting out with something simple as opposed to ending up with something simple. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and Catherine, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that as well, because I know you mentioned during your presentation a little bit about the process of selecting data.
Yeah, I mean, you have to start from what's like, yeah, you want to answer a question, but then sometimes, like you say, you're looking for the data that might exist or maybe should exist but doesn't. So you need to figure out like what else or how else are you going to be able to frame your story in the absence of data, or if it is there and the data, then you ask yourself, of this data, what would my audience want to know? What question does it address that my audience might have? What issue does my audience have that this data will be able to help them understand or be able to come up with be able to deal with? So a lot of the times you have to kind of balance in terms of what is available, and because you have a question and you want to answer it, but what data is available? If it is not there, how else can we respond, or how else can we get answers to these questions? So there are very, very many variables for journalists, especially in countries where data is not as easily accessible. And that's why I was saying journalists need to forge relationships, especially with statistics offices, because there are many, even government officials or whoever is collecting data. A lot of people are collecting data, but trying to kind of cross-ref so that at least you can get an idea as to what the situation might be like. And of course, doing the journalistic thing, go on the ground and do your shoe leather thing and finding out whether what numbers you're getting are actually telling you that. So it's quite a bit of a, how do you call it, a balancing act in most instances.
Thank you. And to stick with you, Catherine, for a minute, because I think this next question kind of ties into some of those issues. We touched a little bit earlier on the issues around misinformation, or at least sort of misleading information, or the misuse of data. And a prevalent theme during 2020 has been the selective use of data by politicians or by certain other groups. And so one question we have here is, how do we enable journalists to see through this selective use of data?
I think one of the things, first of all, is just, like I said, be skeptical and try and figure out why would they be using this portion of data and not the rest of it. So being skeptical and trying to figure out where are they coming from, and then being able to, if you can and where possible, definitely you must get the full comprehensive data so that you can then be able to explain to your audience why a certain politician is only talking about. I mean, we had a case where, let me just use as an example. We had a case where somebody said we had, how do you call it? The government had made some successful, was successful in dealing with maternal child in hospital deliveries for mothers delivery in hospitals. And the data that they used was essentially skewed. They just took one aspect of that data which was collected, and what we did is to now look for the budget data and actually see whether that made sense, because then we found out that actually it was a lie. It wasn't true that so many mothers had given birth in hospitals, because it wasn't reflected in the money that the government is supposed to pay the health facilities where mothers deliver. So there's that kind of a program that was in existence. So in a way, it's you have to look for all. You have to first of all understand why are they doing what they're doing, cherry picking the data, and what is it? What is it that they're going to gain from it? And then what is the full picture? What else? Where else can I get the full dossier, as it were, the full data, so that then I can say, oh, you only saw the left side, you didn't want us to see the right side. The right side is this one. And then you present it that way and also explain why, if you ask them and then they say, obviously, they're stupid things. But if you can actually interrogate and present it as this is what the situation is like, and he's only telling us half of it or quarter of it. So that, again, it's cross-ref, finding alternatives and trying to kind of dig and find what else would be there that would show that this information is being skewed, or this individual or this party is skewing the data.
And Anders, with your background in open data, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this as well, the question of how we can help journalists see through the selective use of data.
So I think there's a couple of things to consider there. I think one piece that is just a gigantic task is what Sarah mentioned early on in this session, which is the critical importance of numeracy and understanding of numbers among journalists. And that's not something that comes around easy. That needs to start in a journalism school, and it's something that needs to be continued to be nurtured. And there's just not an easy way around that, as I see it, because numbers can be manipulated and numbers can be misquoted, but they can also be taken out of context, etc. So we really need sort of an understanding of numbers and figures in newsrooms. I think the second piece to really think about is that the journalism in many countries is under pressure on their business model, and that means that journalists have less and less time to actually conduct journalism. In the United States, we've seen the decimation of local newsrooms, in large part thanks to the fact that that digital ad revenues goes other places. And that means that we don't have enough journalists to go through city budgets to look at how resources are allocated. And I'm not saying that that's the case globally necessarily, but experience from the countries where I've worked is that journalists are under pressure, and many journalists do have the pressure to file a number of stories a day. And if you want to dive deep and and ask tough questions about what numbers a minister is providing or a government is pushing, they might need several days to actually do that investigation. And do you have the time for it? So I think a lot of this comes back to education and to time and for the individual journalist, and related to that, the pressure that journalistic business models are under.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point as well. It's something that a few of you mentioned in your presentations, just the time that it takes to do a lot of this in-depth work with data. And a lot of newsrooms don't really have the resources for it at the moment. Ashwell, coming to you on the producers side, you spoke a little bit earlier about the training that you do for journalists. And one of the questions we have here is whether you see a role for national statistics officers, not only in making the data publicly available, but also in translating that data into news stories and helping journalists to use it well.
Well, most definitely, because I mean, journalists is a very important user segment or stakeholder community, because it's one of the only ways to get to the general public. So we invest quite a lot in terms of equipping journalists to do this. I mean, one of the questions was, how big is our team? So we've got 35 people in the communications team, and 4 of them focus specifically on data stories. So you've got economic statistics, which is one of our core areas, and then you've got social statistics. So for each of these areas, you've got 2 people that works with the subject matter specialist to try to unpack. Because, I mean, journalists do put more flavor to these stories because, I mean, they're very short, but you do want to lead journalists on the right path, because otherwise, if you sometimes just let data out as is, people can get the story totally wrong. So from our point of view, absolute worthwhile investment in making sure that we equip journalists to deal with these data stories. Thank you.
Thank you. And as Sarah mentioned in her presentation, the stories that journalists want to tell don't always necessarily tally with what you think they might want to tell or what you want them to tell. So how do you deal with that sort of slight tension? And I wonder, Sarah and Catherine, if you have any thoughts on that as well. But Ashwell, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that first. I'm not sure if you're on mute, perhaps.
Hi. Sorry. Sorry, just repeat the question. I went off a bit because of the Wi-Fi. Sorry.
Yes, sure. So it's, well, a question for whoever wants to take it, but we've had a lot of questions and a lot of discussion during your presentations as well about the role of national statistics officers, but also the question of perhaps the stories that journalists want to tell from that data doesn't necessarily match what the organisations expect them to want to tell or want them to want to tell. So how do you deal with that tension in terms of working with these organisations and helping to get those stories out?
Should I maybe start?
Sure, please do.
Okay. I mean, from our perspective, it's very important that the journalists get the story right. And one of the fundamental principles of statistics is that we need to respond to when anyone gets the statistics wrong. So we do take some time. We've got a specific officer that links up with all journalists, and so we've got a database of journalists. And so when anyone writes something which is not in line, we do make an effort to respond and make sure that we set the record straight, because when you get the story wrong, it's very damaging to the whole statistical system. So we've got specific people looking at that, and every day we monitor the media. So all the stories related to stats, we look at that every day and make sure that all the stories is in line with what we actually think the data is saying. Thanks.
Thank you. And Sarah or Catherine, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I can add something. This is Sarah. I guess one of the things to think about is the different journalistic audiences, that the people who are under pressure and producing something in 15 minutes, half an hour, 2 hours, that kind of guidance is crucial. They don't have the time to really understand what's underneath the data. I do think that many reporters and journalists often do produce stories that are at odds with what an agency would like the stories to say, and may have a different view of what the data is suggesting. And they would like to hear the input from those agencies and get advice from those agencies, but I think that they would bristle at the idea that their job is to redistribute what those agencies say. So there is a tension there. One solution to that is to really think about journalists in different buckets. And I say that to scientists as well, because there are some journalists who will call up and just want to have a quote or something like that on a study, whereas other journalists are really trying to understand the topic. And then even more, other journalists are trying to use data in original ways that answer specific questions. And they really are three totally different audiences, I think. And sometimes they get lumped together by both agencies and scientists and other data producers.
Thank you. Before I go to the next question, I'm just going to come back to you quickly, Anders, because I know you have to leave a little bit early. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to ask in sort of 30 seconds if you have anything you'd like to say. What's the sort of key thing you'd like listeners to take away from this conversation from your side?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the importance of really training journalists and giving journalists the skills to work with numbers is critical. The importance of mentoring and individual relations between those with data expertise and the journalists. And I would add to that the relationship between government agencies that produce data. We've recently talked about national statistics offices, providing that direct line of information and communication about data. That's actually really important, because we need to discuss, be able to interpret, we need to be able to ask questions about the data, and likewise governments will need to explain how their data is collected. And then lastly, I would say that there's just a continued need to invest in government on data production side. I've mentioned the Paris 21 initiative at OECD that really seeks to support statistical capacity building and resources for statistics offices around the world. And on the journalist side, we need more resources to actually fund data journalism, because it's not always the stories, it's rarely the stories that can be produced on a very short time span, as Sarah Cohn has mentioned. But yeah, I'm very much thanks for having this opportunity. I'll also post my email and the link to resourcewatch.org in the thread. Thanks for all the questions.
Thanks so much for joining us, Anders. I really appreciate all of your insights. And for the rest of us, I think we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left just to deal with some final questions. So one I have here is, if you were designing a training course on the use of data in journalism, what would you include? What would the curriculum look like? So would anybody like to jump in there?
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit. This is Sarah. I do think having, when we train journalists about how to use data, the first thing that we try to do is to kind of get them away from their total fear of it. And I don't know. I don't know if this is universal, but journalists tend to be extremely afraid of data. And so what we try to do is try to break down data so that they can treat it like any other source. If we have a source that's offering an opinion, they might offer an opinion in words, they might offer an opinion in images, they might offer an opinion in data. And the same thing about data being a guess, that it's as close as they can get. And another thing about data being a summary is that it's somehow a way to sum up individual ideas. And I think the closer you can help journalists treat data as if they were any other source is one way to break down the kind of the way that journalists kind of look at you like you're crazy that I'm going to ever look at data again. So I would say that the first thing that has to happen is that getting rid of that fear if you're talking to the general audience of journalists.
I just wanted to add something small. I mean, there's a fear of data. Also need to be able to get them to understand, to learn how to actually do the data journalism, which means being able to scrape and find, scrape,
Right.
and create their own databases. Because I think, especially in some of our countries where if you use data that contradicts what the government claims is the fact, and you might find yourself behind in prison or something. So in a way, it's actually, for me, the beginning is not only for the journalists, but actually with the statistic offices to be able to separate themselves from the politics, because the data they collect is not for, or shouldn't be for, politicians. So in terms of creating a kind of legal environment where data collected by our statistic office are actually made available, because sometimes in some countries we still have the Secrets Act, where the Government Secrets Act, where just saying how many people have paid for the day's cess tax for use of a market is top secret. It shouldn't be top secret. But how do you then compel the state agencies or state statistics office to release that information? Because it can tell me so many things about anybody or anything about, if I'm doing a story, especially about open air markets, they pay so much and yet they don't have the services. So in a way, it's actually creating the legal environment that will allow the kind of go beyond paying lip service about open data and actually practicing or putting in place the legal environment to allow for this kind of data to be shared and be made accessible to the public and to journalists. So there is the fear of data, yes, but I think for me, it starts from the very beginning. How the hell am I going to get this information, this data? And for me, I mean, one of the things is actually being able to scrape that data myself, find it, scrape it, and kind of make sense out of it. Sorry.
Okay. I'll also just add on what could be potentially part of such a curriculum. I mean, one thing I would like people to understand is what quality means in terms of the statistical context. I mean, we've got 8 dimensions of quality. So if people understand what the quality of statistics mean, they could distinguish between good quality statistics and bad statistics and try to use the right thing. I mean, we would like to think our website is a little bit intuitive, but maybe it's not as intuitive as it should be. So we definitely want to teach people how to use it better and how to find what they need. Also, we have 265 releases annually. So almost every day, a statistical release comes out. So I would want people to understand what comes out, what it's used for, and who generally is the audience of what gets released. Also, I would like people to understand the statistical system. I mean, understand the system of national accounts, understand things like GDP, CPI, or employment, or mid-year estimates. Understand these big 5, we call it the big 5 in statistics. So for journalists to understand that, how it's compiled, how it's used, what it means. Just the basics, but understand the basics and what it means. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for those insights. I'm going to move on to the live questions we've got coming in here now as well. So one of the questions is, people are interested to hear about the resources and networks that journalists use to support their interest in data. Where are you getting your data? You mentioned national statistical offices. Are there other places that you would regularly go? I'm going to direct that one to Catherine, I think, to begin with.
I mean, you can get the various. You can get data from not only from the government but also from university research and stuff like that. You can also get data from international NGOs, although they tend to be very old data as usual. But you can also what we found works is actually working with research organizations. So, for example, the Africa APHRC, if you're looking for up-to-date data on a specific health issue, we could actually go to the research institutes because we have researchers who are doing that. And that's why I'm saying you need to kind of connect the dots and work, not depend only on one source. So there are those ones. And then, of course, there are databases that you can create on your own by scraping from whatever, from newspapers and stuff, or even from other government records that are being provided by maybe one agency, and then you check with another agency and try and put that together if your statistics office is not actually sharing that information, because most of them, or in most instances, they don't have a regular release calendar, or they don't release the data anyway unless you demand for it through an FYA or something. Yeah.
One other question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just going to add that, in the U.S., we rely very heavily on our Freedom of Information Acts to get raw administrative records rather than compiled statistics. And we do a lot of scraping of those of what local and state and federal governments make public one by one, say inspection records or death records or something like it, to compile data sets ourselves. And we also do quite a bit of our own data collection. So I would say that from the official statistical agencies, that comprises a very, very small amount of the data that data journalists in the US are using.
I just also want to add, from South Africa's point of view, I mean, you can start with a statistical agency because they would, of course, know what they've got and what other people have got. So that's a good place to start. But what we've also got here is what we call national observatories. So we've got currently a national data observatory for COVID. So all COVID related data, whether it's health, economic or social data, you can get from that. But then you've also got regional data observatories like the Gauteng Regional Observatory. And those are good places to start to find certain data sets in the country. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And we've touched a little bit there on the sort of pros and cons of using highly simplified or sort of already packaged data sets versus the raw data and perhaps more complex data sets. We've got a few questions here that touch on that somewhat. So one question is, what is the trade-off between showing very simple graphics that will be easily understood versus very complex graphics that could be misunderstood? And as a media outlet, how do you find that balance? Or perhaps as a National Statistics Office releasing information as well, how do you find that balance between presenting something that has enough detail in it but is also easy to understand? Sarah, would you like to kick off on that one?
Sure. I guess one of the first things I would say is that when I was at the New York Times, and I left there about 3 years ago, one of the things that we found was that complicated graphics almost get very little activity on the web for two reasons. Catherine had mentioned one reason is that most people are consuming on their phone and they don't come across very well. And the second is that people actually don't love data that much. They love stories. And so more and more in journalism organizations, you'll see data unfold as a story rather than kind of be presented as a dashboard. My own preference is, if it's going to be complicated, make the raw data available instead, and let people, with kind of the philosophy of the open government movement, let people who have questions and have a real interest in trying to simplify it. But that's my own kind of bias on this, is that very complicated infographics, I just don't think that most people want to see them, and a lot of people don't have the capability of seeing them, but that's just my own bias on that.
And Ashwell, do you have any thoughts on that as well, in terms of the packages of data stories and packages of data that you're putting out there? How complex do you go?
For us, simpler is of course much better. I mean, there's a major research now being done into the psychology of how people look at these infographics, and as stats agencies or data providers, one should do the necessary research to understand how people look at these and try to make it as simple as possible. I mean, if a infographic must be complicated, then it's probably not the right way to present the data, and you need to rethink your strategy. So simpler is better, but also doing the necessary research in terms of how do people consume data, how do people look at these things, and how do people understand it? Because I do agree with Sarah that people just don't like. I mean, we love statistics, but people don't generally love these things, and you need to make an effort to make sure that we present it in a way that it's easy to understand. Thanks.
I guess I'm just going to add, as a little bit of an aside, like here in the US, every state practically has used these Tableau, it's a company called Tableau, dashboards to present their COVID data. And those dashboards get a lot of traffic. And the reason is nobody can get out of them any of the information that they're looking for. So people spend a lot of time on those sites trying to answer questions that they can't answer from them. Some of it is because the government doesn't have the information. Some of it's because it's difficult. But that trying to piece together this information, sometimes when you see people spending a lot of time on a site, it's not that they love it, it's that they're frustrated. But I do agree, as somebody mentioned in the chat, that people are much more engaged with data in the age of COVID. And I think that's totally true. I do think there's some frustration there in the age of COVID about, I'm just not getting my questions answered.
Thanks so much, everyone. We've got loads more we could talk about here, but we are running a little bit short of time. So just to round things off, I'm going to ask you all the same thing that I asked Anders, which is, just in 30 seconds, could you give us kind of your key message? What's the most important thing that you want people to take away from this? Sarah, let's start with you.
Yeah, that there are, just like there are different audiences for your data production, there are different audiences among journalists, and understanding which one you're dealing with will make your lives a lot easier as data providers. And also that we just really thank you for all of your work as data producers. We know how hard it is. And so a big thank you to everybody.
And Catherine?
I just want to, the one thing I want to take out from me, or people to take away from me, is that data, or collection of data, or resource in our statistical offices is not, it should be everybody's responsibility, journalists as well, because at the end of the day, what we do is to try and tell the story of our people and what they're going through, and maybe present to them what is happening. So when it comes to pushing for open data, when it comes to pushing for how data is going to be released, we should be part of that conversation. We shouldn't let it just be an NSO's conversation, government and NSO and their statistics office. It is a conversation the public should be involved in, and we can only do that by showing them how data and the collection of data is important for their well-being. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Ashwell.
Thank you. I mean, statistics and data is very important for people's lives. I mean, it's when we look at COVID statistics, I mean, it's people. I mean, it's people getting sick and it's people dying. So it's very important that we understand these statistics, and it's very important for people in order for them to take part in a democratic society. Now, because of this, it's very important for us as the data producers, whether it's now us as stats agencies or even journalists. It's very important that we make sure that citizens understand, and it's only if they understand that they can be involved in the conversation. And therefore, I say we need to make every effort to make sure that we leave no one behind when it comes to the numbers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all of those insights, everything that you've presented today. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, but thanks so much to our speakers and to everyone who's tuned in. You can follow the forum's website and Twitter for updates on the conversations that are happening as part of the forum. On Twitter, they're at UN Data Forum, and you can also use the hashtag UN Data Forum to follow the discussion there too. So thanks again for joining us. Thanks to all of our panelists, Sarah, Catherine, and Ashwell, and of course Anders, who had to leave us a little bit early. And we hope you all keep safe and well wherever you are.